Alright, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Baron. Welcome back. So this is War Thunder Naval Units Preview Part 2. Part 1 was where we looked at the screenshots, and Hambone and I talked and mused about what we saw and what we hope to see within the game, as well as a lot of speculation regarding various units, more specifically the carrier. Part 2, I will be looking at the various screenshots that I found within the game. Also, a big shout out to MoarPye, an Aussie from the forums and from Reddit, who helped me find a lot of screenshots as well as helped identify a number of them. So a big shout out to you. I really appreciate it. So what we're looking at right here is the Sims class destroyer. It was commissioned in 1939. It had a speed of 37 knots, 4 5-inch guns. You can see 2 forward and 2 aft. It had 8 torpedo tubes, where you can see the 2 quad launchers kind of amidships right there. And pretty cool destroyer. And let's see. Now we're on the CLEMSON class destroyer. Now these were called 4-stackers, and when you look amidships, you can tell why they were called 4-stackers. It was commissioned in 1919. And these were developed primarily for an anti-submarine role. They had better range, so they had more fuel, which dealt with a little bit less armor and a little bit less speed. And they also had depth charges. And this brings up something pretty interesting, and that is the fact of, will we be able to see submarines? Maybe not at launch, but maybe sometime in the future. And by launch, I mean when naval units are implemented in this game. I would really like to see submarines. Personally, I'm a big fan and advocate of them. Now we have the New Orleans class cruiser. This was commissioned in 1930s, and this brings up a pretty good topic, just how the CLEMSON class destroyer brought up the topic of submarines. The New Orleans class is a good example of what level of customization will we be able to have within the game and over individual ships, if not ships of various classes. And this was brought about because there were 3 distinct designs within this class, and also there was a 1942-1943 refit where this cruiser was given radar, better fire control direction, and better anti-aircraft cover. Now something pretty interesting, quick little tip, is that cruisers are defined by being less than 10,000 tons and having smaller than 8-inch guns. So, and that was given by the Washington Naval Treaty. That's the Washington Naval Treaty is also pretty interesting because it kind of shows why certain ships at the beginning of the war were smaller than those at the end of the war, and why certain nations only had certain ships and what sizes available to them, and this kind of affected the Americans, the Japanese, and the British. And obviously there's the Treaty of Versailles, which had a huge impact on the size of the German Navy, and why they as a nation had fewer battleships and heavy cruisers. So now we're looking at the Yorktown class carrier. And the Yorktown, there were 3 ships in her class: the Hornet, the Yorktown, and the Enterprise. And the Enterprise is the most decorated ship in the United States Navy. The carriers in the Yorktown class were relatively fast. They could go up to speeds of 32.5 knots. They were relatively versatile, and they could launch a lot of aircraft. 80 aircraft in the Enterprise's case. And also customization. You have what you may have available to you at the beginning of World War II, and then there's a refit where the Yorktown or the Enterprise was given, it moved from its quad 1.1-inch guns to 40mm Bofors guns, and it changed to 50 caliber machine guns to 20mm Oerlikon guns, and that could be a terrible pronunciation. But customization, really curious to see what level of customization we'll have over our ships. Now we're looking at the Lexington class carrier. And this was based off a battlecruiser hull. It was built in the 1920s, and it only had one aircraft catapult compared to the Yorktown classes, which had 3. Now this kind of brings up, I think for me, one of the biggest topics regarding aircraft carriers, and that is whether or not a carrier's role will be simply to be a mobile airfield for player-controlled aircraft, where player-controlled aircraft will launch off of you in certain maps, land on you to rearm and refit and repair, or whether or not there will be that in addition to the carrier having AI-controlled aircraft, where the aircraft carrier is now not just a mobile airfield and mobile anti-aircraft battery, but also has some offensive capability and some strategic and tactical choices, and whereby you send your fighters, your dive bombers, and your torpedo bombers at what targets, at what times, and things of that nature. Now, moving on to the WASP. Now, the WASP was the only ship in her class, and this will probably be a relatively low-tiered American aircraft carrier, as she was launched with almost no armor, a very modest speed, and no torpedo protection. Now, the Pennsylvania class battleship, and this is the first battleship we'll get a look at. The Pennsylvania and the Arizona were commissioned in 1916. The Arizona, both of them damaged in Pearl Harbor, capable of 21 knots. Get out of here, Crow. And had 14-inch guns. And the Pennsylvania is pretty interesting in that, you know, she's a World War I battleship. So she had what she was capable of prior to World War II, and then also there was a World War II refit. So that goes to customization, and generally refit was when you'd get things like radar, better anti-aircraft cover, and switching a lot of, you know, various gun systems and stuff like that. Also, if you look on the second to rearmost turret, you'll see a little rail, and that was where the spotter planes were launched from. And I think spotter planes are also a very interesting topic for me personally, and this kind of goes into, if carriers have AI controlled aircraft, why not have AI controlled spotter aircraft? I think that'd be really interesting. If ships go the way that aircraft are going now and you have full real battles, you're going to need spotting planes, because a lot of the targets you'll be firing at when you're a giant battleship like the Pennsylvania are over the horizon. You can't see them directly. You have to use spotter planes and smaller craft. So another pretty interesting topic. Here we have Higgins boats, and you can see them being launched from this transport. Going to be pretty interesting. You know, will we be able to play these in missions at least, or will you know, if your crew, can you launch Higgins boats? Because right now we can see them being controlled by the AI on the map Lonely Island, where they have an impact on who wins the map. So it would be kind of interesting. Granted, they would have you get hit once and you're dead by almost anything other than machine guns. But it'd be kind of interesting. Who knows? It's fun to speculate about. And now we have the PT boat. Kind of looks like PT-109, very famous PT boat because of JFK. PT boats were, ones of this class were capable of 41 knots. The Japanese in World War II nicknamed them devil boats. You can see 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. There were 50 caliber machine guns used as anti-aircraft, as well as, you know, against other smaller naval craft. Customization also comes into this, whereby some of the 50 calibers were replaced with 20mm cannons, like the one in the aft portion of the boat, and even some PT boats were modified with 37mm anti-tank guns mounted forward. That would be kind of interesting to further give a little more depth to PT boats. And also, if there's a weather system and you have high seas, if you have a 37mm cannon on the front, making you a little top and nose heavy, you know, you hit a big wave, could you swamp your boat? Things of that nature, where like you have to make trade-offs, and depending on the weather, it could, you know, benefit you or really, really hurt you. So now we're looking at the 1936 B destroyer. Pretty sweet looking ship. And here we have the Bismarck class battleship. Now the Bismarck class battleship was capable of 30 knots, distinctly quicker than the Pennsylvania class battleship, which was a World War I style battleship, only capable of 21 knots. The Bismarck also had 8 15-inch guns in her 4 turrets. Very, very impressive German battleship, but this brings up a pretty fun topic, and that is air cover. If carriers have AI-controlled aircraft, you'd want to guard battleships with some of your fighters, as well as guard yourself. And that is because battleships were very, very vulnerable to aircraft. Just look up the Battle of the Denmark Strait, where ferry swordfish torpedo bombers, which I think are British level 1 or level 0 British aircraft, which are currently in the game, and they basically took this thing out of action by hitting its rudder. So pretty cool stuff. And damaging of rudders and screws, or screws are the big propellers in the back, it really kind of brings up the topic of what will the damage models of ships be? Currently we have a placeholder for the AI controlled ships where they have hit point model. You know, X amount of X sized bombs will kill a battleship, and you know, destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, whatnot. But it will be really interesting to see how detailed ships' damage models are, and also kind of maybe show why, if ships are really, really intricately detailed, which I really hope they are, why Gaijin is saving them for last. So now we have the Illustrious class carrier and the Wix class British destroyer, and I think the Wix class was actually an American class that some were sold to the Brits. Man, why did I flounder over that derp? Anyway, the Illustrious class kind of brings up a good topic. British carriers predominantly had armored flight decks, whereas American carriers predominantly had wooden flight decks. So that means dive bombers would be much more effective against an American carrier than a British carrier. Now the trade-off, the British carriers had better survivability, could take more damage. The American aircraft carriers could launch more aircraft. Now I tell you this, if there's no AI-controlled aircraft within carriers, which one are you going to want to float around? I'd pick the British-style armored deck as opposed to the wooden decks. So this kind of is another thing of like why, as carriers, you'd really want to see, I mean, for me personally anyway, AI-controlled aircraft and having that option and further the level of customization. But let's see. So now we are looking at the Leander class light cruiser. Now I think this is one of the most aesthetically pleasing ships that I've seen, and it could be the angle I had, and it could be just the angling of that single stack. I don't know, it's a pretty ship as far as I'm concerned. Now it's a light cruiser, and generally I think light cruisers were considered to have guns up to 6.1 inches, and the Leander had 8 6-inch guns. It had secondaries, and it had torpedoes, and it had 1 aircraft. Furthermore, bringing up whether or not we're going to have spotting aircraft. You can see the cranes where I'm not really sure. Some spotting planes were float planes that would literally be craned over the side of the ship and then launched that way. And also when in retrieving them, they would be retrieved that way. They would float up next to the ship and they would be craned back up. Other ships had catapult and rail systems. If spotting planes are implemented, and I think they'd almost be essential for full reel and more realistic style battles with naval ships, that would be another level of customization, which would be pretty cool. So now we are onto the Japanese, and we're looking at the SHIRATSUYU class destroyer. Now the SHIRATSUYU class destroyer, commissioned in the 1930s, it had 8 24-inch torpedo tubes, and I'm not really sure if this is accurate or not, but what the source I read, The Shiratsuyu also had 18-inch torpedoes, so someone can double check me on that. The 18-inch torpedoes were the torpedoes that were used on aircraft. But also 5 127mm naval guns. And there's two things that are pretty interesting that the Shiratsuyu kind of brought to mind when I was looking at this with this ship. The first is that the Japanese historically had really, really good torpedoes. At the beginning of the war, the Americans had, their torpedoes were absolute rubbish. So different national advantages, which are kind of being showed with aircraft, as Gaijin has expressed that they want to go forward with this game in a historically accurate mindset. So it'd be interesting to see the Japanese with far superior torpedoes compared to the Americans at the beginning of the war. Something else about the Shiratsuyu was that their torpedo launchers were lightly armored so that they could be protected from strafing aircraft. Now, I think that was a pretty key point, and this deals with ships' damage models. I would really enjoy seeing see how the anti-aircraft guns are crewed by individual people, and certain softer targets like torpedo tubes, if they're not protected, an aircraft could fly by. It'd be fun. You want to be able to strafe ships and it actually have an effect. You could hit torpedo tubes. You could hit the crew manning the anti-aircraft guns. You could strafe the, the main observation points, and that could have an effect on the ship. It'd be really interesting to see a very detailed damage model where, as a strafing aircraft, you'd actually have something to do and you could hurt a ship. Here's the KUMA class light cruiser. This brings up customization within ships and within ships of various classes. The KUMA was very interesting. Two of the ships of this class were converted to high-speed transports where they were tasked with DAIHATSU class landing craft launches. So I'm not really sure if there will be a point system where certain ships can launch landing craft and they get points for how many land and if they take certain objectives, or if you could even direct landing craft to be sent somewhere. That would be pretty complicated, but it would be interesting to see. Now, prior to those two ships of the KUMA class being converted to that, they had basically giant broadsides of torpedo tubes where they could launch 20 torpedoes a side. Now, this was a tactic that was considered outdated for World War II, so they were converted, but it could be kind of fun to see in the game. And also, during World War II, a lot of the KUMA class cruisers were refitted to allow them to better defend against aircraft and therefore serve as better escorts to, battleships and carriers and like. And that would mean you basically take off one of your turrets, one or two of your turrets, and then put in double or triple mounted 26mm Japanese anti-aircraft guns. And that would be interesting to see. Also, a lot of them were given radar later in the war. And that deals with national advantages too. Japanese had very, very good torpedoes, but they didn't really have radar until very late in the war, whereas the Allies enjoyed radar earlier in the war. So now the MYOKO class heavy cruiser, commissioned in 1928. That was when the Japanese were pretty much like, hey, screw you, Washington Naval Treaty, because it exceeded the 10,000-ton max limit for cruisers. This thing was 11,000 to 14,000 tons, capable of 35 knots, and it had 10 7.9-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. It had torpedoes. It had secondary and tertiary batteries, which you can see on the side. And it also carried 2 aircraft, and you can see their ramps kind of in the cranes right in front of the rearmost turrets. Now we have the Shokaku class carrier. Now, commissioned in 1941, just in time to participate in Pearl Harbor. It could take more damage than contemporary Allied carriers, so going more to show national advantages and historical accuracy. It had 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 36 1-inch anti-aircraft guns, and the aircraft it carried were 18 A6M Zeros, 27 D3A1 dive bombers, and 27 B5N torpedo bombers. Now, customization in AI-controlled aircraft, if that was implemented, it'd be fun to kind of play around with the various numbers of aircraft and the orders in which you'd want to launch them and send them at various targets. It would make carrier gameplay very, very fun and very, very immersive, as well as historically accurate. That was my little plug at that, Gaijin. So now we have the AKAGI, and this was based off a battlecruiser hull. The AKAGI was all over the place. It participated in the Sino-Japanese War in the 1930s, then the Pearl Harbor, the raid on Darwin in Australia, the Indian Ocean raid, Dutch East Indies, and then it was sunk at Midway. Commissioned in 1927, but it had certain design flaws. Mainly that the fuel tanks were oriented in a way that they were part of the hull. So when the hull dealt with any severe weather or was any damaged, the fuel tanks would leak. This is obviously a fire hazard. Also, the AKAGI had a fully enclosed hangar deck. Now, this was not a very good idea because the Japanese policy was to have their planes on the hangar deck, and the hangar deck is right below the flight deck, which you can see here on the top. So on the hangar deck, they would have their aircraft fueled, armed, and even running. So the fuel vapors would collect on the hangar deck. So imagine if a bomb gets dropped and goes right through that wooden deck and hits a fully loaded, D3A1 dive bomber. That bomb's performance was just magnified. And obviously this ship had a lot of trouble with fire control. So a lot of Japanese suffered with bad fire control. So maybe that will be reflected as a national advantage or disadvantage. Now here we have the Kaga, commissioned in 1929, originally on a battleship hull, capable of 28 knots and holding 72 aircraft. The Daihatsu landing craft, which is similar to the Higgins boat. I don't know if we'll be able to play it or even maybe just in a mission, who knows. Now the Yamato class battleship. Now, for a lot of you people who just want guns, this will be one of the ships you will flock to. And obviously it will be very, very high tiered. So you will grind away trying to get to this ship. Now the Yamato, there were 3 of her class, all of them suffering very, very terrible fates. 2 of them were battleships, and 1 of them was a giant aircraft carrier, the Shinano. Now, the Yamato class battleships were capable of 27 knots. They had 9 18.1-inch guns, 6 6.1-inch guns, 12 5-inch guns, 24 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and 4 13.2mm anti-aircraft guns. They also had 7 aircraft on board, 4 Aichi E-13As and 3 Mitsubishi F-1Ms, which are a level 0 Japanese aircraft currently in the game. Now, those aircraft were obviously used primarily for spotting because these guns could be fired at targets over the horizon. So you couldn't see them. You'd have to fire at them indirectly using fire control systems and scouting planes. So I think in full real battle, I think we will see spotting planes. I mean, it almost seems a necessity. Now, something interesting about the Yamato, she only fired on enemy ships 1 time, where she destroyed an American aircraft carrier, I believe, or damaged it. And she was destroyed by carrier-based aircraft carriers, or excuse me, carrier-based aircraft and torpedoes. The Musashi, the Yamato's sister ship, took 17 bombs and 19 torpedo hits. So while these things are very vulnerable to aircraft, the Musashi took just a crazy amount of damage. The Shinano which was the carrier based off of this hull, was the largest vessel to be sunk by a U.S. submarine, and she was sunk by 4 torpedoes because the Shinano had terrible flood control systems. So, national disadvantages? Who knows? Alright, now we are looking at a cargo ship. I think cargo ships should be playable. And before you be like, what are you talking about? I want you to look up some things. German commerce raiders of World War II, auxiliary cruisers, armed merchantmen, and Q ships, British Q ships. If you want a really good tale on what some of these ships were used for, read up specifically on the German auxiliary cruiser, the Atlantis. Some pretty crazy stuff. I think at the very least, armed cargo ships could be used in certain historical battles or missions where they're AI controlled, or maybe for those who are really into, would just really like to play this. Obviously it would be a minority of players. Make them premium ships that could be playable, but you'd have to purchase them, because obviously Gaijin would have to spend the time and money to put these into the game, play test them, model them, program them, all of that. So, and if they were played by a certain minority of naval players, make them premium. I think that seems perfectly reasonable, and it would add a lot of depth to the game, because if you're a destroyer or a patrol boat, you're like, oh, I'm going to sneak up, or a PT boat, I'm going to sneak up on this cargo ship and, get in close and just shell it. And then all of a sudden it opens up and fires back at you. That'll get your heart pounded. So here's a patrol boat, and this was, I found it on a number of maps, and it's kind of a generic placeholder model for patrol boats for any of the factions. I wasn't able to identify it. And then finally I found this recently. It is a landing ship tank. This ship basically swims right up to the beach, opens a door at the front of the boat and just launches tanks. I don't know if that'll be player controlled. Anyway, this is pushing 27 minutes. I actually did this before and got in a lot more detail and was pushing 40 minutes, so I redid it. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm Baron, and I'll see you all out there. Historical accuracy, certain nations will suffer where they historically suffered, but they will be very fun in other areas. P.S. I would like to see the Italian Navy and submarines. But anyway, enough digression. Next topic that was covered. This one's going to be kind of a combination. It deals with airfields, and it also deals with bombing, bombers, and bombs. So there you go.